I do believe in relying on ketones and free fatty acids as a primary source of fuel. I think we're well designed to do that. We've always selectively hunted the fattest, sassiest animals. What we have between our ears has an enormous metabolic demand. And if you're relying on sugar to fuel that, then you're living on what I call metabolic kindling all the time. So what's the alternative? Well, you go out and you find a nice big fat log, right? And you put that on the fire, and suddenly now you're free. True vitamin A, retinol, is found exclusively in foods of animal origin. And obviously the richest natural source of vitamin A is liver. Your immune system can't function without it. In my book, Primal Fat Burner, I talked about the three amigos, which are vitamin A, retinol, vitamin D3, cholecalciferol, and then vitamin K2, MK4, which is the only form of K2 that we evolved consuming. We all have the same foundational nutritional requirements. There is nobody alive for whom a vegan diet is an optimal way of eating. Plants have never been a primary source of nourishment for humans.
Nora, what does it mean to be a primal fat burner?
As a human species, we're actually designed to be one of two things. We're designed to be either primarily a sugar burner or a fat burner. And 99.5%, maybe 99.9% of the general population is relying on glucose as its primary source of fuel. And we are led to believe that that is what we have to do. And the fact of the matter is that we're actually extraordinarily well designed to rely on fat in the form of free fatty acids and something called ketones as a primary source of fuel. And in fact, we're unique in all animal species in that humans are the only species on Earth that is capable, has a brain capable of running on almost nothing but ketones full time. And it is vastly superior as a source of energy, of reliable, long burning, even burning energy than glucose. And it allows for, it allows for not having to rely on constantly snacking and whatever else to keep that blood sugar up. Blood sugar plays no part in, almost no part in the cognition, in energy, in mood, and whatever else in a person that is relying upon fat as a primary source of fuel. And I consider that a form of metabolic freedom. I consider a reliance upon glucose to be a form of metabolic slavery. And so that is basically, in a nutshell, what it means to be a primal fat burner. And I use the term primal, there are other people out there tossing the term primal around as though it actually means something. I chose the term, I think I was the first person actually in the ancestral space to use the term primal. Um, and I chose it because it harkens back to our earliest origins as a species and the selective pressures that actually shaped us to begin with, as opposed to like the so-called paleo crowd that is largely looking at, what indigenous people groups around the world did for about the last 10,000 years. But our journey started 2.6 million years ago. And for the vast majority of that time, we have actually relied largely upon, fat as a primary source of fuel. And that it's actually the fat from the animals that we hunted that shaped our brain, that shaped our central nervous system, and shaped our immune function, everything. And when you look at the brain of a human versus the brain of, say, our closest primate relatives, we have a cognition that runs on a highly elongated form of omega-3 called docosahexaenoic acid, or DHA, which is found exclusively within the fat of animals that have been allowed to consume a diet that is natural to them. And that's what our brain runs on. And the fatty acid composition of our brain is very, very closely tied in to the fatty acid composition of animals versus plants, right? So, closest primate relatives have a largely omega-6 based cognition, if you want to call it that. Ours is an omega-3 based cognition and a DHA based cognition, which cannot reliably be gotten from plants that have ever been a natural part of the human diet. And so, uh, obviously, animal source foods play a very key role in all of this, but it's the primary caloric intake in a what I call, because I had to distinguish myself from what everybody else was doing. I mean, I call what I do a primalgenic approach, um, because I needed to separate myself from what was going on in the so-called paleo crowd, or the keto crowd, or what have you. There are a lot of problems kind of riddled throughout those approaches that can mean almost anything. There are as many different versions of paleo or keto as there are people out there claiming to practice that. And so I really, really didn't want to get caught up in, um, have my work conflated with what everybody else was doing. So that was the reason I chose the word primal, and it's something that kind of needs to be clarified from the outset, because it just went back further than so-called paleo.
For somebody consuming a conventional type diet right now, wanting to make the shift to this diet you've been talking about, what does that look like in a practical sense?
In short, in a nutshell, so to speak, it involves basically eliminating sugary and starchy foods from the diet, and consuming, and it's okay. Fibrous vegetables, in my view, are okay as long as you tolerate them well. They provide. We don't have any dietary requirement as a species for fiber or for plant foods at all. Actually, we can do without them, and we have done without them for stretches of time throughout our history. But fibrous vegetables and greens do form a substrate for healthy fermentative bacteria in our colons. We don't have a fermentatively based digestive system like ruminants do, but the fibers do provide, a fermentative base, as do the connective tissues of animals, by the way, which are actually even more effective that way, to be honest. Um, and they, it also provides more dietary diversity, and it's one reason why I have reservations about what people are terming the carnivore diet. It's not that plants are required; it's that it allows for, number one, more interesting meals, to be able to incorporate fibrous vegetables and greens as we are able to tolerate them, which not everyone can. But that diversity also produces a tremendous diversity of our, microbiome, our bacteria. We have most of what makes up humans in terms of living cells isn't even human. You know, we have uh, this whole microbial ecosystem in our bodies that regulate a lot of different things. And the more diverse your diet, the more diverse that microbial composition, and the more diverse that microbial composition, the more resilient and robust your immune function is going to be. And our immune systems are under attack from all sides. And we could do a whole show on just that, on all the different ways in which we're under siege. And so anything that we can do to support that, I think, is a good thing. And again, I like the dietary diversity. I enjoy having a variety of textures and flavors on my plate. Not just the steak topped with a pork chop with a slice of bacon on top, as delightful as that might be. And the other thing is that the dietary diversity in animal source foods is also important. So the nose to tail thing, right? Consuming all parts of an animal that are edible, the organs and tissues, and even glands and things like that, I think are something certainly that our ancestors did. And unfortunately, here in our particularly American Western kind of paradigm, our culture, a lot of those foods have kind of fallen to the wayside in terms of they've fallen out of favor. People just they they're not drawn to them. They think they're gross, or they're just not accustomed to consuming them. Now, there are obviously countries in Europe that that relish those things, but we tend not to. When we think of meat, we think of steak, fish, chicken, blah blah blah, and that's pretty limited in terms of nutrient value and density. Probably the ultimate superfood of all time, certainly better than turmeric or garlic or whatever else that they're saying is a superfood nowadays. One that puts them all to shame, not even close, in terms of competition, is liver. Which contains just an incredible density of nutrients that are so important to the functioning of our immune systems and our brains and all our organs and tissues. So I'm not saying it's a diet that consists of liver, but I mean, it incorporates those things. It incorporates those things in hopefully a palatable way. I have recipes and all that stuff, but um, and so what I focus on is eliminating sugar and starch to the extent possible, and then moderating protein content. Okay. So this isn't a high protein diet that I'm advocating for here. It's about protein moderation, keeping our protein intake roughly to what we actually require, as opposed to just eating as much as you want, a big steak on your plate or whatever else. And there are reasons for that. And then deriving the majority of your actual calories from the naturally occurring fats present in those protein-based foods. And, cooking and things like, well, I enjoy cooking with duck fat. That to me is just, it's a delicacy. Or tallow or lard, I guess coconut oil. The thing about some of the plant fats that are embraced as being, so healthy and clean, like avocado oil or olive oil, or coconut oil. Well, avocado and olive oil have not as high a smoking point as would be ideal, right? But they also don't have a whole lot else of what your brain or body require to, to fuel everything that your body requires, not just fuel, but supplying the nutrients that are required for the functioning of your immune system. When people think of animal fat, they just think of saturated fat and that's it. But even a fat grass-fed steak with a nice layer of fat around it and well marbled is still more than 50% unsaturated fat. It's mostly monounsaturated. There is saturated fat content, and that's good because saturated fats, by their very nature, are intrinsically resistant to oxidation. And they can be helpful in protecting some of the more delicate polyunsaturated fats, like the naturally occurring omega-3s in meat or fish or whatever else. They serve a role in protecting those fats and helping, move them to where they need to be in the body without premature oxidation. So saturated fat's a perfectly wonderful thing. But people forget about the fact that meat also contains just a plethora of other fat-soluble nutrients, depending upon the type of meat you're consuming. But true vitamin A, which is, I think, the most underrated and unsung fat-soluble nutrients, that's just so underappreciated, is only found, true vitamin A, retinol, is found exclusively in foods of animal origin. And obviously the richest natural source of vitamin A is liver. Your immune system can't function without it. You want a healthy immune system, you want healthy lungs, you want, a healthy skin, healthy all kinds of things. Vitamin A is very, very, very critical to that equation. And it works together in tandem. In my book, Primal Fat Burner, I talked about the three amigos, which are vitamin A, which retinol, vitamin D3, cholecalciferol, which is naturally occurring in, it's actually the richest natural source of dietary D3 in the human diet currently, that's widely available. Well, not widely available, it's hard to find actually, is 100% totally pastured pork. So who knew lard was a health food? But it is. It is a very rich source of naturally occurring vitamin D3. And then vitamin K2, MK4, which is the only form of K2 that we evolved consuming. And one of the things that I get my hackles up over is the fact that the number one source of K2 in supplements now is a form called MK7. And almost all the K2 products on the market right now, and most of the health pundits out there that are peddling supplements or whatever have bought into this. It's almost all MK7 now. There were a group of Dutch researchers that found that they could take genetically modified bacteria and then ferment a soy product called natto and derive this MK7 product. And of course, most soy is genetically modified as well. Soy was never meant to be a primary food source for humans. We did not evolve consuming this. And again, it's largely unnaturally cultured, but it's a form of K2, but it's not the form that the human body recognizes. And so the only form of vitamin K2 that that is found in the human brain, for instance, is MK4. That's the only form of K2 your brain will allow. If you're a pregnant woman, it's the only form, K2 MK4 is the only form of K2 that is allowed to pass through umbilical blood into a fetus. And the body doesn't, the purveyors of, K2 MK7, oh yeah, this is the best form, say, oh, it keeps really high levels in the bloodstream. And well, it keeps high levels in the bloodstream because the body doesn't know what to do with it. So it floats around there. MK4 gets used pretty quickly, and it plays such a variety of roles in our health that it kind of isn't even funny. But one of the key things, of course, because people are popping vitamin D pills like crazy. Well, vitamin D facilitates, among many other things that it does, it facilitates the absorption of calcium, which most people are getting too much of anyway if they're consuming dairy. And God forbid calcium supplements, which nobody should take. But the problem is that without K2, so vitamin K2 plays the role of, vitamin D helps the absorption, but K2 actually helps to direct the calcium to where it needs to be in the body, where it's actually going to do you good. Without the presence of K2 MK4, you're going to be absorbing calcium willy-nilly, and you may very easily end up calcifying things that were never meant to be calcified. Your arteries, your heart, your brain, your joints. And that's a problem. Naturally occurring vitamin K2 MK4 is found in the fat of animals that have eaten nothing but fresh, pasture, fresh, what's natural for them. It's actually a little bit higher in poultry fat, and particularly duck and goose fat. Goose fat especially, and partly because geese they're grazers, they're like deer. They just sort of eat grass and greens all day long. So they get a lot of K1 in that diet, which their bodies very efficiently convert into K2 and, MK4 for storage. Goose as a food, goose liver pate is probably the richest source you can eat, but it's found in the fat of other grazing animals as well. And it's really important. And I don't know if your viewers are familiar with Weston A. Price, who he was.
I definitely am, and I would assume a lot of them are.
Okay. I don't know if some background is needed, but what he discovered, anyone who's familiar with his work is familiar, he talks about something called Activator X. And Activator X, he didn't know what that was. What he knew was that it showed up really strongly, like in the fats of animals in the springtime and whatever else, where they were eating rapidly growing grass. And so like grass-fed butter and ghee are also very rich sources of K2 MK4. But he, science hadn't really identified what that nutrient was. He identified it as the sort of anomalous nutrient in fat sources, animal fat sources, and he found that people that ate the most of it just had exceptional health. There was something magical about it in his mind. It wasn't until more recently that a Japanese researcher actually identified K2MK4 as the likely candidate for what Weston Price was calling activator X. And so, yeah, and it's one of those things that almost nobody knows, and it's unfortunate. So there is and I don't have any stake in this company at all, but the richest supplemental source of K2MK4 that is available anywhere. There is a particular strain of emu oil. And the only company that I know that carries it is one called Walkabout Health Products. And they are entirely focused upon this particular strain of emu that is producing the highest levels of K2MK4 anyone's ever seen. And so there's that. Now there are synthetic versions of K2MK4 that one can purchase, but they're synthetic. It's fair to say that most of the research done on the subject was actually done using synthetic K2MK4. So okay, the problem I have with it, of course, is like the problem I have with almost any research around a single nutrient is that no nutrient exists in a vacuum, right? They're all designed to kind of work together in concert. They have synergistic effects on one another that cannot be extrapolated from an isolated nutrient evaluation. But the Dutch researchers basically, they took all the research around K2MK4 and they said, well, this is K2 also, so therefore we can extrapolate, right? And so we are therefore offering all the same benefits. And by the way, there are sort of lawsuits pending and all kinds of things around that. I think eventually this will come out, but I urge people to stay away from supplements containing K2, MK7 because we ultimately don't know long term, what those are going to do. But all we do know is that there's actually no basis for it in our evolutionary history. And anyone that says that can convert, that MK7 converts to MK4, is trying to sell you something. And the same thing with K1. I've known practitioners who used to just give people K1 and say, well, that'll convert to K2. Well, so like, it's sort of like beta carotene. It can be legally called vitamin A, even though it is not true vitamin A. It is provitamin A. It takes 6 to 20 units of beta carotene to form a single unit of actual vitamin A. And that's only in persons who are optimally healthy metabolically. They've got a healthy liver, healthy thyroid, etc. They can make the conversions. But even then, you will never meet your actual vitamin A requirements using plant-based sources. It's not possible. And the same thing with omega-3s. People think, okay, omega-3 is omega-3. So linoleic, alpha linoleic acid from or alpha linolenic acid from, say, blades of grass and chia seeds and flax seeds and sachinichi oil and whatever else. They are nowhere near the same thing. There is a huge conversion process that needs to go underway. It's an elongation process. And the very first step in that process is an enzyme called delta-6 desaturase. And there is a huge percentage of the population, particularly people of Northern European descent, Celtic descent, in native descent of some kind, who don't have that enzyme at all. So that conversion is a non-starter. Even for people that, number one, have delta-6 desaturase, and number two, are not part of those ethnicities, if they're slugging flax oil all day long, apart from the fact that they're probably putting themselves at risk for a stroke, they are lucky to be able to convert, assuming all their organs and glands are functioning normally. maybe 3% to 5% into EPA, and maybe none at all into DHA. And if DHA is not in your diet, it's not in your brain. So I'm just saying. And we've got a lot of people with brains that aren't working too well nowadays, if you hadn't noticed, which is why I live off grid in the middle of nowhere. Anyway, so these are all, anyone that says, oh, yeah, we can convert K1 to K2. We don't really have a basis in our evolutionary development for the requirement of that. Plants have never been a primary source of nourishment for humans. It's always been kind of a side dish when it was available, during certain times of the year, or, once we developed cooking, we were able to broaden our consumption of plant-based foods because they contain so many anti-nutrients that cooking will help to neutralize some of that and also break down the cellulose and make it a little more digestible. But where there may be a lot of nutrients in greens, for instance, and again, I don't have a problem with consuming them if you enjoy them, but we don't have a digestive system that is designed to extract all the nutrition from plants. We don't have a fermentatively based digestive system. We don't have 4 stomachs that are able to convert that plant material into much more nutrient-dense nutrition. And for instance, fermented vegetables are kind of a popular thing, the raw, fermented kraut and stuff like that. You will have probably 300% more vitamin C in fermented cabbage than the raw cabbage that kraut was made from. And that's what a cow's rumen does. That's, what ruminants do. Rabbits had the ability to make better use of those things that way. And again, it's all the bacteria and fermentation throughout their gut. A chimp has about 60% of a chimp's gut is dedicated to fermentation, which is why they all look like they have beer guts, and gorillas, and that kind of thing, because it's a big fermentation vat in there. And they are letting the bacteria make much richer use of the plant material. They're able to ferment into all kinds of nutrients and nutrition that weren't present in the plant when they first consumed it. We don't really have that ability. We have only about 20% of our human digestive system is actually devoted to fermentation. It's our lower GI tract, our colon, and even the even the butyric acid and whatever that's produced is mainly meant for the health of the colonocytes, the cells that line the colon. It isn't really supplying us, the rest of us with energy. And it's actually interesting to point out that really all large animals are designed to rely on fat as a primary source of fuel, in a manner of speaking. Like even a cow, 70% of its caloric intake of its calories that it uses to fuel itself are not actually coming from carbohydrates that they consume all day long. It's coming from the short chain fatty acids that are a byproduct of the fermentation of the plant fiber, butyric acid and acetic acid and and whatnot. It's primarily butyric acid that cows and deer and whatever else rely on for energy. But they have to go through this whole process, in order to do that. So we don't have that ability. So we're designed to get our energetic fats directly from the animals that have synthesized them for us. And from there, we're able to utilize free fatty acids and something called ketones, which are water-soluble energy units of fat that actually, so fatty acids supply twice the energy of carbohydrate or protein in terms of calories. Ketones can supply 4 times the amount. So it's a super high charged thing. And when you have a large brain, roughly 25% of our brain's metabolism, or 25% of our calories, I should say, actually go to brain metabolism as adults. It may be up to 85% in an infant, and 50-60% or whatever in toddlers. So like that's a tremendous amount. What we have between our ears has an enormous metabolic demand. And if you're relying on sugar to fuel that, then you're living on what I call metabolic kindling all the time. You can do it, and I heat my house with a wood stove. I live in the mountains and I get real winters here. So, and if all I had, was kindling to heat my house, I could certainly heat my house that way. But I'd have the doors to that wood stove open all day long. I'd be sitting in front of it, obsessed with where the next handful of fuel was going to come from to keep it going, to keep the house warm. I'd be crumpling up paper, throwing twigs in there, little tiny, pieces of wood, etc. And it would take up a lot of space and a lot of time and energy in order, and a lot of focus, to keep it going. So what's the alternative? Well, you go out and you find a nice big fat log, right? And you put that on the fire, and suddenly now you're free. You're free to go about your business. You can forget about it, throw it in, and, set it and forget it, as they say. You can go run your errands and go do your chores and whatever else. You can try to sleep through the night. There's an analogy to be made there. You wake up in the morning or you come home later and you peek in the stove. Oh, fire's burning down. Just throw another log on. And there's a tremendous amount of freedom that comes with that. And a lot of also mental clarity that comes with that really can't come from something that burns so fast and furious and with such volatility as glucose. Glucose is designed to be our rocket fuel for emergencies. A saber-toothed tiger jumps out from behind a bush and starts chasing you around, or you're being charged by a cantankerous woolly mammoth. Glucose is suddenly going to become a primary fuel to fuel your. It's going to fire your adrenals fire, and when you're under stress, that sends a big glucose surge, and it may allow you to outrun that threat. But do you really need rocket fuel in your car if you're just going to the corner grocery store and you're just going about your daily business? If you're not a professional race car driver, or expecting trouble, the vast majority of what we can rely on all day long, that's very even burning and reliable, is our free fatty acids and ketones. So,
well, let's get practical with what a plate could look like, given the macros you've been discussing. We want to bring down the carbs, moderate protein, and high fat.
Well,
but
yeah. So
the part I just
fat,
want to clarify before you jump in here, a lot of people who eat in a similar way say high protein is the way to go. And what I want to hone in on here is the protein piece, moderate. Because when you start really bringing the animal foods in, naturally you're going to bring in fats and proteins. But how do you do it in a way to maintain those macros the way you stated them?
Yeah, so I don't put a lot of thought or obsession into the macros other than, because I'm accustomed, I guess, to eating the way I do. But so something, one of the things that is kind of important to, well, for instance, a breakfast for me might look like I raise ducks for their eggs, and so a lovely duck egg, which are nutritionally vastly superior to chicken eggs, and I think they taste better. But I have an immune reactivity to chicken eggs anyway, but I prefer duck eggs in any case. And maybe a couple pieces of a beautiful, pastured, thick-cut pastured bacon or something like that, just as an example. And then maybe some sliced cucumbers, from my garden with a little vinaigrette on there of some sort, or some sliced tomatoes, which are fresh right now. And there you have it. Calorically speaking, in that on that plate, the predominant calories are really going to come from the fats on that plate. Again, protein supplies half the caloric value that fats do, And carbohydrates, well, cucumber isn't giving you much of anything calorically. And so that would be an example, for instance. So, so when I started out on this sojourn of figuring out not just what did humans eat and how did we evolve and all of that, because I asked myself a whole bunch of questions along the way. It's like, well, just because a, an ancient human was able to pick something up wherever, stick it in their mouth, chew it up, and swallow it, that we shouldn't just automatically assume that that food was optimal for them any more than it might be optimal for us right now. So how do we know? One of the cool things Weston Price did that I really appreciated, and very few of his devotees actually appreciate, is that, of course, he traveled over a course of 10 years, over 100,000 miles around the planet, and he studied so many indigenous cultures and traditional cultures around the world that were still thriving on dietary practices that they'd been exercising for hundreds or even thousands of years. And we're talking about the Aborigines in Australia. We're talking about the Inuit in the high Arctic. We're talking about Native North American tribes. We're talking about South American people groups, people in Africa, people in the remote Loschental Valley in Switzerland, people in the Outer Hebrides Islands, and all these places. And obviously, those diets are all going to look really different from each other. And he examined the health of all these people groups and found that, yes, when they were exercising their traditional diets, etc., their ancient diets, they seemed to have extraordinary health and freedom from disease, and they had excellent skeletal structure, excellent dental health, excellent everything. Mental health was a big one. But what he asked himself was, out of all of the healthiest people that I studied, what dietary elements did they all have in common? And he found there were two things that were of primary importance. Number one, they all consumed as many animal source foods as were available to them. In other words, he looked all over the world to try to find a vegan culture. He thought for sure there had to be one out there somewhere. He never found one. He was quite disappointed about that. But secondly, the most important foods, the most sacred foods, the most venerated foods in all instances of optimal health were those that were highest in fat and fat-soluble nutrients, largely animal fat. And therein, in my mind, lies a foundational basis anyway for the fundamental nutritional requirements of every human being alive. And another pet peeve of mine, I've got a list, but another pet peeve of mine is the idea of, like, you hear the term all the time at conferences and lectures and whatever else, and they say bioindividuality. Oh, it's all about bioindividuality. A diet that's right for one isn't right for some. Look, what makes us human, intrinsically human, are not our differences. It's those things we share in common. We all have the same basic, type of brain and nervous system. We have the same, type of endocrine system, immune function, etc. We all have a blood pH range that needs to run somewhere between 7.35 and 7.45 to be healthy, or else. And we all require roughly the same range of nutrients on a foundational basis in order to be optimally healthy. Now, from there, yes, there are individuals that can't tolerate this or that or the other thing. I consider what mostly gets termed by bioindividuality as nuance. Look, we may all, have unique, little fingerprints, but we all have fingers, and we all have the same foundational nutritional requirements, and there is nobody alive for whom a vegan diet is an optimal way of eating. There are people that can get away with it for periods of time, and I have the references for what I'm about to say, but anywhere from 75 to 84% of all vegans within 10 years have abandoned that way of eating, and almost always due to health-related issues. And so, we're not designed that way. You're not a cow, you're not a rabbit, you're not a deer or a goat or anything like that, or even a chimp for that matter. And a chimpanzee's brain hasn't changed appreciably in like 4 million years. And why is that? Why is theirs not changed and ours has? Well, because they're still swinging from the vines and eating their leaves and bananas. And we had an early ancestor that found a compelling need, probably as a result of some catastrophic change, a geological time period in which there were cataclysms or whatever else. There was some catastrophic change that forced us to look at things differently. It forced us to reach for something different. And once we began, even Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy, was the earliest hominid skeleton. I believe they've since found ones that are even earlier, but she was originally believed to have been a vegan animal. And they've since found, well, no, they actually used stone tools to cleave meat and marrow from bone. Once we began doing that and we began energizing ourselves in that manner, we began developing fairly rapid encephalization, which is, in other words, brain growth. And once, we got about 2 million years ago, Homo erectus was the first of our ancestors that had a full-time hunting economy. And from there, the brain size just exploded. I think it probably reached its zenith about 20,000 years ago with Cro-Magnon humans. Our brains were about 20% bigger then than they are now. But we've lost about 11% of our brain volume just in the last 10,000 years where we adopted agriculture and began relying on these commodities and whatever as primary source of so-called nourishment. And that's where we began developing the early forms of what we started calling the diseases of civilization. So, the cultivation of grains allowed us to, not have to roam around so much and rely on hunting as much. It allowed us to concentrate our populations more and store food for longer periods of time, which also gave us, nation states and, and all kinds of things that arose from there and, perpetual war to protect those stores. But it isn't really how we evolved. And so part of my thing is that, so I was going to talk about the fact that just because we chewed something up, swallowed it, and whatever, and then Price asked himself those questions. But I wanted to look at, how do we know what's actually optimal, and even in terms of macronutrients? And looking at longevity and anti-aging research provided those clues. And it turns out that in one of the common elements in all centenarian, for instance, humans, are very low insulin levels and very, low manageable glucose levels. Really, the less insulin you require in the course of your lifetime, the longer you're going to live and the healthier you are going to be by far. Insulin isn't exactly a blood sugar hormone. It is actually really more about coordinating our energy stores with reproduction and lifespan. It is about taking excess nutrients and putting them into storage for later use, in case of a famine or whatever else. But of the three major macronutrients, proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, the only one for which there is no established human dietary requirement, not in any textbook of physiology anywhere, is carbohydrate. We can manufacture all the glucose we actually require from a combination of protein and fat in a diet. Better to get it mostly from fat. And so we have, roughly the average person who relies on glucose has roughly 5 grams of glucose floating around in their bloodstream at any given moment. You consume something that's got 10 grams of carbs, now you've doubled that. And your body because your body's obsessed with maintaining the lowest level glucose necessary because glucose is intrinsically damaging. It attaches itself to proteins and fats and causes them to become glycated. In other words, kind of gummed up and misshapen and whatnot. And that is a major part of how we age is through glycation and cross-linking of proteins and things like that, which is a function of glucose largely. And so when we have too much glucose going into our bloodstream at one time, insulin activates to take those excess nutrients out of the bloodstream quickly. It's been erroneously identified as a blood sugar hormone when in fact that really isn't what it is, but it gets used that way for people, particularly those relying on sugars and starches in their daily diets. So, but it's interesting to point out that even yeast generates insulin, and it's the same molecule. And yeast don't have blood sugar, So it's this very ancient molecule that just has this adaptive purpose, that allows us to survive a famine or whatever else, or helps us store excess nutrients, like some of our more Neolithic ancestors would have probably consumed in more temperate regions where it was available. They might have consumed a lot of fruit in late summer, whatever, and gone into a little bit of insulin resistance. That served an adaptive response to upcoming harsh conditions, right? In winter, where food is much more scarce, if you can put on a layer of ballast, if you will, a layer of extra fuel, that might give you a little bit of an edge in terms of survival through the winter months. So, we're so far removed from the natural environment in which we evolved that people just don't really have a grasp of any of these things. And the thing is like, insulin resistance once upon a time served a useful purpose, perhaps for some people during certain times of the year. But nowadays, I don't care if you're living in Minnesota or you're living in Florida or Cabo or wherever, we're all inside where it's roughly 72 degrees, all day long. And so winter ain't coming for us anymore the way it once did. And yet we have this unnatural access to this unnatural abundance of food and food-like substances. And when you are relying on blood sugar as a primary source of fuel, empty calories seem to serve just fine for that, for that addiction. Most of us don't have to take more than 2 steps to be able to grab a handful of something we think of as food and throw it in our mouths and eat it. Our ancestors didn't have that. So, all of those things that were part of the selective pressures that shaped us are now, have now kind of started working against us, right? The ways in which our bodies reacted to our environment once upon a time are now working against a lot of people. So what you generally find when you're eating the way I'm talking about is that eating becomes more of a choice as opposed to a necessity, right? You find that you forget to eat actually. And the other peeve I have, another one on the list, is the excessive emphasis upon what is thought of as fasting. And there are a number of reasons why I have an issue with it, partly because one of the things I wanted to take into account, for instance, when I came up with the approach I did, were the unique selective pressures, shall we say, and circumstances and issues that we are facing today as a species that our ancient ancestors couldn't have even begun to conceive of. And we have, ever since World War II, our topsoil, we've lost about 60% of our topsoil, which also means we've lost about 60% of the nutritional value of the foods that we grow and that are fed to animals that we eat oftentimes. And so we have, number one, less nutrient value in the foods that most people are consuming, and which makes it harder to meet your nutritional requirements to make you resilient and make you optimally healthy and have great immune function, etc. And that's part of the problem. But also because we are living in such unprecedentedly high stress times, I think by design, right? Every single newscast or whatever it is that you want to look at, wherever you get, whether it's through mainstream legacy media or even, even some of the better alternative media, most things are very alarmist. Everything's kind of, designed to, um, trigger a stress response. And when you're in that state of what, I worked with the brain for over 20 years in clinical practice, and we have our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic nervous system. Most people that I worked with during the years of my practice were just overwhelmingly marinated in sympathetic overarousal, right? Which manifests as anxiety and stress and an inability to sleep. And digestion is a parasympathetic process. We have to be in a calm, relaxed state in order because digestion starts in the brain, actually, not the stomach. We're hopefully relaxed. We begin to, detect the aromas of certain foods and whatever else that triggers then brain chemicals that then stimulate the release of certain substances that stimulate gastric, pH and hydrochloric acid production. And then it's all a north to south process. And the pH of our stomachs is really, really important. And stomach is an acid organ. It needs to be. It's almost pure acid in there. Most people don't suffer from too much hydrochloric acid. They suffer from not enough. And if you are in sympathetic overarousal, you're in a fight or flight state. You're being chased by a cantankerous woolly mammoth or an ugly date or whatever. That adrenaline shuts down all of that. And everything goes to fueling your muscles, and you're getting that blood sugar jacked up so that you have the rocket fuel to outrun whatever it is you're trying to get away from, metaphorically or literally. And so most people have crappy digestion as a result. So not only are the nutrients we're consuming less, but our ability to extract those nutrients and make optimal use of them, can be less. And now you're going to fast. Fasting is not a nutritional strategy. Now, I'm not altogether opposed to people who say want to do that intermittent fasting where they're just eating within a certain window of time in the middle of the day. I get that. And that's fine, except that what's really important is that you're getting all your nutritional requirements met in that window, and that you're eating, the most nutrient-dense foods possible in that window. The beauty of the approach that I've developed is that you get all of the benefits of fasting without the downside. You're not hungry. You're moderating your protein. So one of the reasons fasting is so beneficial. So the reason I advocate for protein moderation is that there's a metabolic pathway that was discovered by, people doing longevity studies, and actually they were doing other kinds of studies, but they discovered this pathway called mTOR, which stands for mammalian target of rapamycin. And they found that it gets activated by an excess of protein. And again, this is like insulin. It's about coordination of energy stores with reproduction and lifespan. So if you consume just say a ginormous steak or something like that, anything over about 4 ounces or so of that steak is likely to trigger an mTOR response. And what that says is, wow, we've got tremendous nutrient abundance right now. This is a good time to make a bunch of new cells. It stimulates cellular proliferation. Well, if you're a baby, a child, a teen, pregnant or lactating or whatever, that may make sense, and your protein requirements may be is slightly higher because of that. But if instead you consume just what you need, protein-wise in a meal, and I have a calculation for that I provide, in my book and whatnot, but that you can help you figure out roughly what that optimal amount for you is based on your estimated ideal body weight and that kind of thing. A lot of people use lean tissue mass, but who's going to go and get that testing done? Nobody. So most people think of themselves as having been their best, had their most optimal when they were their leanest. So we'll just choose, we choose that as kind of a general thing. But when you consume just what you need in order to maintain your, your body mass and your fundamental protein requirements, but you don't exceed that, to put it in modern day economic terms, it's like saying, well, honey, it's too expensive to build a new home right now, so let's fix up the one we've got. And that's what your body sets about doing. Goes into autophagy. It starts to go into detoxification mode. It starts to go into cellular repair mode. I mean, what's getting repaired is you. Rather than taking the damaged cells, ignoring them, and just making a bunch of new cells, your body instead turns around and focuses on your own healthiest maintenance and repair. That is some of the benefit that is gotten from fasting. But the problem in that is that for people that are accustomed, especially people who are accustomed to relying on sugar as a primary source of fuel and are using fasting as a way to kind of, forgive that sin or get around it, it's a roller coaster ride, and the effects of intermittent fasting are intermittent, rather than full time like they could be. And then you don't have to be hungry, and you don't have to be depriving yourself all the time. And it can take a few months to become fully adapted to relying on ketones as a primary source of fuel. It is a process. This isn't something that flips back and forth in any efficient manner whatsoever. When people are doing their fasts and whatever else, yes, you'll start producing a lot of ketones when you stop eating sugar. Doesn't mean your body's efficient at making use of them. And it doesn't mean you're not going to have a whole bunch of cravings for that rocket fuel that you were dependent upon. And so, it's a struggle, and it's really uncomfortable for a lot of people that are relying on blood sugar. When you are reliant instead, you have a full-time reliance on ketones as your main source of fuel. Again, you just aren't hungry. I mean, eating, you make, so you're able to make better decisions, right, about what you eat when you eat. It's not like, oh my God, I'm going to chew somebody's arm off. Oh, there's a bag of chips, thank God, and whatever else. You're able to kind of pick and choose, and you're clear-headed about it. Nowadays, people aren't more than one or two missed meals, most people, from a state of total emotional and metabolic chaos. And people get crazy really fast when the grocery store shelves go empty. I'll tell you a story about something I did that I don't recommend anyone else do. It was something, I had a curiosity, and I just thought, I'm just really curious about this. And so I was already ketogenically very well adapted, and I decided to see how long I could go without eating and what that would do. And I was measuring my ketones and glucose levels and all that kind of stuff, whatever. But it was actually a seamless thing for me, because I didn't go through, withdrawal. I didn't go through the blood sugar crashes and whatever the people go through when they try to fast, and it just gets really uncomfortable really fast. I just didn't have that. It was fine because I was already. Most people have 100,000 calories or more of extra, fat on their bodies that they can draw from to make more ketones. So you don't have to be eating to make them. Um, and I will tell you in all honesty, well, it's not like hunger wasn't a big deal during that time. It was kind of like a scratch I couldn't itch, a little bit, or itch I couldn't scratch rather. Um, the thing is, as humans, food is such a major part of the way we engage socially, and it's such a major part of what we derive pleasure from. It was a bummer. It was just kind of a bummer. And I'd wake up in the morning and think, okay, what should I make for break? Oh, darn. Oh, I'm not eating right now. Shoot. So um, it cut into my social interaction and all that kind of a thing. It was interesting all the ways in which not eating was impactful on different levels, but energy wise, mental clarity wise, I was doing just as well on day. I went 21 days without eating anything. I was, and it was the same on day 21 that it was on day 1 for me. Now I'm not saying that was a healthy thing for me to do at all because I knew that it's like, okay, me and Gandhi, 21 days, cool. I'm going back to eating again because I probably deprived my body of a lot of nutrients during that time. It's not just about calories, right? It's about nutrition. And so it wasn't a healthy thing to do, but it was a very interesting exercise. And it is definitely, uh, it is an excellent adaptation for survival because if you're in a situation where things are chaotic or, food isn't available or whatever else, you need clear thinking in order to sort your circumstances out and figure out what you're going to do next and where you're going to find the food. And then you have to have the energy necessary to go out and find that food. And if you're dependent on sugar when that happens, you just kind of go crazy. Um, or you just crash and can't function, or a little of both. And so I just, when you want to talk about a nutrition for a new economy, um, there's a lot to be said for this approach. The other interesting thing to point out, um, I have this dear friend. Her name's Carolyn Rush. We've known each other for a very long time, and she was a vegan for a long time. And then one of the things she was obsessed with, uh, because her mom was a single mom and had all these kids, so they were very frugal. And her mom subscribed to a publication called the Tightwad Gazette that used to exist. It doesn't exist anymore, I don't think. But it was kind of devoted to making the most of every dollar. How do you know, how can you make the most of how can you save money on everything? How can you stretch things out and live on a minimal budget? And, how do you make use of that empty toilet paper roll? Whatever it is. And it became kind of like a game for her. She became really expert. She had all of the issues. She memorized practically everything in them. And she wanted to learn, it was a game for her. How cheaply can I live? And then what she could make, I mean, she was, maybe making, I don't know, when she was a massage therapist making not that much money, but she paid for her own home in cash, and all that kind of stuff. So isn't opposed to, Carolyn would say, I'm not opposed to spending money, I'm opposed to wasting money. She's a heck of a lot more fun to hang out with than you might think, actually. You just don't go out to restaurants much. But she came out to visit me. Oh, and so once I wrote my first book, Primal Body, Primal Mind, she read that and said, wow, okay, you've convinced me. She says, yeah, I need to stop this vegan thing. So she began adopting that way of doing things. And then she came out west when I was living in Portland. She came to visit. And we were hanging out in the kitchen one morning and eating breakfast. And she's like, man, this is so good. This is, I feel like I'm getting away with something. And you do sometimes feel like you're getting away with stuff eating this way. It just seems decadently delicious. She says, this is actually the cheapest way of eating optimally well I've ever discovered. And I went, what? And I did not expect her to say that. I would not have said that. I would have said, well, because the way of eating we're talking about completely uncompromising sources of food, 100% organic, preferably organic in the way that you have a firsthand knowing of where that food was grown, how it was grown, and it's fresh and locally available and all that kind of thing. And only the meat of animals that have been allowed to live a life that's natural to them, right? Because the health of the meat or fat you eat directly correlates to the health of the animal that meat and fat came from. So grass-fed and finished and fully pastured and all this kind of stuff. And all those things, as we know, are quite expensive. And so my argument would have been, well, you're going to save money in total health costs down the road, et cetera. But it never occurred to me that it's actually a cheaper way of eating than the standard American diet, that most people think that that's all they can afford to do. That's another peeve of mine. The idea that in order to be well, you have to be wealthy. And that's total BS. And so my friend who bought her a home in cash and makes maybe 20 grand a year and travels, by the way, all the time, is always traveling around the world to different places and whatever else, which most people don't think they can afford to do. She just, she doesn't waste money on stuff. And, she eats this way and says it has saved her massive amounts of money. So I find myself sinking to one knee and I've got my hands clasped like this. And I'm like, will you please write a book? And will you please call it Primal Tightwad? And she went, okay. And so she did. And it's in a PDF now. She, for years, she was making the rounds, doing interviews and things like that. And it was fun for her. It wasn't really her primary vocation in life. She did it because I asked her to. And then her life has gone on to other things. And she said, here, Nora, I'm giving it to you. And that's like, well, I don't want to make money off of your book, because that didn't feel right to me. What I have done is I've made it available. So I'm on the board of the Price Pottinger Nutrition Foundation. And I've, provided that PDF to the foundation, and they will provide it as a freebie, to anybody becoming a member, which is, I think, that feels good to me. But one of the things that she found, one of the brilliant things that she did, actually, she took a week's worth of menu from the standard American diet, realistic, stuff, your hamburger helpers, your ground beef, your chips, your salsa, your, sodas and whatever else, your pizza nights and whatever have you, that standard American diet consumers consume. And she calculated down to the last penny what it costs for a month to eat that way for one person. Oh, not a month, a week, because it was a lot of work for her to do it. But she did it, and she calculated down like, tablespoon of ketchup, 2 pennies or whatever. And then she took a week's worth of menu from the way of eating that I'm talking about, and she did the same calculations. And at the end of that week, not only was it cheaper to eat the way I'm talking about, it actually worked out to about $1,500 per person per year cheaper. So there's another nutrition for a new economy, when you're not having to buy, processed food for starters is pretty expensive. But also, if you're relying on carbohydrates as a primary source of fuel, you're going to be a lot more inclined to want a snack. You're going to be buying all kinds of stuff that really isn't serving you too well. Most of what is sold in grocery stores, which is all the center aisles, is stuff that probably you wouldn't be making much use of in my way of eating. And it's where, and also when it comes to the most expensive item on any grocery bill nowadays is the protein, right? You go out and try to buy a steak, God help you. It's expensive. However, if all you're consuming, like, you know, when the person I'm living with and I, when we like have a steak dinner, we take a steak and we cut it in half and we each have half of it. And it's plenty. I mean, I'm telling you, I never walk away hungry after dinner, like ever. When you're adapted to making, having those fat calories dominate your plate, fat is intrinsically satiating. And, you find that when you're eating that amount of protein that you require, but not exceeding that, even though, you know, our, our eyes are bigger than our stomachs nowadays. We want that big juicy steak. But when you realistically, if you're sitting down, you're enjoying your dinner, you're not wolfing it down, whatever. By the end of the meal, you're fine. You're not bogged down. It's not that hard to digest. And but you're saving huge amounts of money um, on on trying to buy protein in excess of what you actually need. So
Let me jump in here. I want to go deeper on the protein piece. So I understand your reasoning by moderating the protein. And you just talked about the steak, cutting it in half. And it doesn't sound like you're hungry at the end of the meal. But let's talk about lunch and dinner. More practical examples. You gave a breakfast example there. But I'm just trying to understand how you're building your plates because carbs, they're down. Protein, moderate. High fat, but what does that look
calorie-wise,
like? What does that look like, though? Give me examples of what your dinner plates might look like.
well, I will tend to choose like fattier cuts of meat. I eat, duck eggs. I'll eat bacon. Things that have a higher fat content to them. Um, I use animal fats, and I will use sometimes coconut oil or whatever, and I'll make salads with a lot of olive oil, and all of that. So calorically, that that brings that brings the calories up. Um, and then it's kind of whatever I have. I live off grid, and you know I do grow and raise some of my own food. Um, Working on doing more of that, and I have the ability to hunt and fish and all of that kind of thing. But it's kind of like whatever I have available. Um, Sometimes it's like that show Chopped, I think it is, or whatever. I'm not a TV person, but I've watched a couple episodes of that where you've got gummy bears and French bread and this and that, and now you got to make something fancy out of it. And so as I find myself going through the fridge and finding stuff and just kind of putting things together. Um, I make my own sauces and my own salad dressings and things like that. Um, and so I like sauces. I do. Um, In fact, I'll probably be making a big pot of sort of a bone broth based soup, tonight, and it'll have the best grass fed ground beef I've ever had in my life, and then I'll maybe put some tomato puree in that and saute some onions in duck fat and add that to it, and just whatever from the garden, just kind of throw it in there. Um, it's really really good. Um, And I find like things with soups and whatever, I make a big pot of soup and that feeds us for 2 or 3 days. Um, I don't usually do anything with lunch. I'll usually eat kind of a late breakfast. I might have some coffee or some tea in the morning or something like that. I'll eat kind of a late breakfast. Um, and then I'm not really thinking about food. I mean, I live on a homestead, so I'm working all day long. Um, And and then, late in the afternoon, I start thinking about preparing meal for dinner, and I try to, create as much variation and as much, variety of things, might maybe some greens from the garden, like last night there were tomatoes and marinated cucumbers on the plate and some, sautéed, greens and garlic um, and things like that. um, along with the amazing pork ribs that I had. But anyway, um, and it's intrinsically real satisfying, and it's not that complicated, really. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. So it's not like everything on my plate is swimming in fat. It glistens, but you know, there are plant foods on my plate. Um, they're not sugary or starchy. And although I do have, I bought this property and had an amazing mature orchard. So I'll walk through and I'll grab a handful of blueberries or raspberries or grab a little plum off a tree or something now and again. But um, I don't eat enough of that stuff to mess me up. It's just, and there's never been a chemical on this property. So everything is really pristine and things are grown. Um, um, incredibly cleanly. So I feel like incredibly fortunate to have what I do. And there's a lot of wild forage around here and stuff too. And a lot of the previous owner planted a ton of like food forest stuff. So nut trees of all different varieties. I've got almonds growing out there and hazelnuts and, just all kinds of things, pine nuts. Um, and so, um, yeah. And when it comes to feeding, my ducks, probably 90% of their diet is wild forage. One thing I found is that, at first I'm thinking, well, I have to have something supplemental for them, like in the wintertime or whatever else, because they're not able, they don't migrate and and there's a lot of snow and it's harder for them to forage. So I was looking at organic feeds. And what I discovered is that every organic feed made for poultry and probably every animal that feed is made for, they all contain the allowable levels of literally toxic ingredients. And it's like, you're kidding me. Um, and so that was a rude awakening. So I literally assemble a bunch of different things that I put together and ferment for my ducks. I create my own feed for them because I don't trust what can be bought pre-manufactured. And it's that extra step, but boy, they love it and they do extremely well. And if you ferment the feed, you get 2/3 more nutrition and 1/3 the cost, you know? So it's a win-win all the way around. Um, I think that we've arrived at a time in history where it makes a lot of sense, to not just have that firsthand knowing of where your food comes from, which is pretty important, you know? There are all sorts of horror videos out there about what people are finding in their store-bought salmon or their meat or, whatever else. I mean, who knows where some of it comes from. Uh, and So it makes sense not just to know where your food comes from, but to, decentralize your access to food as much as possible. Yes, support your local farmer, but to the extent humanly possible, try to become your local farmer, you know? We've at the Price Pottinger Foundation, we've created something called the Food Freedom Project Initiative, which is not just about, um, well, how do you grow tomatoes and zucchini in your backyard? I mean, that's fine if you do that. You're not going to live on tomatoes and zucchini, right? And it's very, very hard for most people, even if they live in a rural setting, to do it all themselves, to get everything they need from their own space. I'm doing my level best to do it all here. It's not practical for 99% of people out there, or even feasible. So what it's about is not trying to become, you know, uh, Rambo, where you've got, a wall full of buckets of beans and rice and ammo, and you're trying to, tough it out on your own, or um, or to where you think that you have to do it all yourself. It's about finding people that live near you that you have a relationship with, friends, family, whatever, in your immediate area, getting together with them and, you know, and figuring out who has what, who can do what, you know? Like, even if you're just growing sprouts on your windowsill, at least you're doing something. So-and-so over here might be really into hunting and fishing or whatever, and they go out and they come back with extra meat that can be shared. Maybe, Tiffany over here, she is great with tomatoes and zucchini, and then this other person here has chickens, or duck eggs, I don't know, or somebody's raising rabbits or goats, or somebody over here, they've got beef cattle, or um, or this person over here who knows all about natural foraging, and coming together and figuring out, who can do what, and therefore there's a division of labor, but there's also there's also something that's very natural to our species, which is just sort of a decentralized, localized system of food production and procurement that isn't reliant upon centralized systems that don't have our best interests at heart. Let's just say, to put it mildly. And so we have one of the things we created when we first created the Food Freedom Project is something we call the Thanksgiving Challenge, and which is kind of a fun way of getting into it. And of course, we've got that time coming up in the not too distant future. Yeah, I better get the rest of my firewood assembled. But anyway, where rather than just going and buying your butterball turkey or whatever else, getting together with friends or family that you want to spend that holiday with, and figuring out how you can obtain locally or through your own efforts, whether growing or raising or whatever else, all the ingredients necessary to make that Thanksgiving dinner. Doesn't have to be turkey, it could be whatever. And the exceptions could be, condiments and spices and things like that. Obviously, you're going to probably get those from other places, most of them. But to be able to put together a meal that is something that you and your friends or family put together yourselves from what was available in your immediate environment. And when you do that, number one, it's really fun to do. But once you've had that meal, you realize we've got this. We know how to do it. We know where to get different things. And it's not up to just any one person. We work together as in more of a community kind of form, which is so key to all of this. Food sovereignty is great, but and we should all have it, but not everybody can do everything themselves. So we need to, reach out a little more and be, we are a social tribal species. We're designed to do things that way. If you're trying, like the show Alone, I am a fan of that show. But these people go out, they are world-class experts at survival, right? World-class experts at primitive skills and knowing what to do, how to get food and water and stay warm, and all of the things that they need to survive for an extended length of time by themselves out in the middle of nowhere. And it's really, some of these people just really do have extraordinary skills and abilities. The most limiting factor that they all run into, almost all of them run into, the number one reason why most people end up, quote unquote, bugging out and dropping out of the competition doesn't have to do with the fact that, that they couldn't find food or water. It's loneliness. It's the lack of other human contact that they just can't deal with anymore. And we're really, we're designed to do things together. And when we work in a more of a community context, when we're working together like a social tribal species is meant to, life becomes a lot less complicated. There are divisions of labor that can be had, and different people are, this person's strength is maybe this person's weakness, and vice versa, so that they can support each other and help each other get through difficult times. Developing maybe a bartering economy amongst yourselves and things like that. That's the economy of the future is a lot more of that, and it's also as my friend Catherine Austin Pitts would say, relationships of trust. And we have to take those things into account as well.
Your current living situation, you're in Idaho, homesteading, off-grid. I know
In
you
the
haven't been
mountains.
there for too long, a handful of
5
years.
years.
Okay, 5 years
Yeah.
now. This community aspect, I really love what you're getting into here. Have you been able to form that with people around you where people are working together and have a common goal?
To some degree, yes. We're developing that community. It isn't necessarily, I mean, I have some immediate neighbors that I do have a really great relationship with, and so we do have some of that. And then I've met people, other people in the area under different circumstances that I've developed really wonderful relationships with, and we share similar goals and values and things like that. People who are experts in organic growing, and people are into, I've also gotten into beekeeping and all that kind of thing, and so there's a whole community around that, and other people know a lot about foraging, and so yes, there has been a lot more of that kind of, sharing, and, it's really, it's really rewarding. I'm not as isolated as people think I am. I don't live in a big population center, that is true, and I have no regrets about that at all. In fact, my hope and my goal is to actually never see another city again as long as I live. I have no intention of ever getting on an airplane ever again or going to any kind of major metropolitan area. I just, I, I've done a tremendous amount of travel all over the world, and I've met the most amazing people and seen amazing places and done amazing things, and it's awesome. And I'm really happy to be where I am. It's breathtakingly beautiful. It's pristine. It's very insulated from the insanity of the world. Um, and I have clean water, relatively clean air. There's no, industrialization anywhere around here. There's down on the prairie, they definitely do their share of spraying on their crops and things, but I'm up pretty high, so I don't get a lot of that overflow. And because of that, and probably got the healthiest beehive in the entire area. Um, um, but and it's just the wildlife is amazing, and living in direct communication with nature and its natural rhythms and the seasons and all of that. You're having to be aware all the time of what's happening with the temperature, what's happening with the weather, what's happening with the forecast, with whatever else, because it all matters a lot in terms of what your chores need to be that day and whatever else. Um, and I save a lot of money on gym memberships. Yeah, chopping wood and hauling water and doing all this stuff. And it is very hard work. Um, but gosh, at the end of the day, there's no place on planet Earth I'd rather be, and there's no other way of living I can imagine living anymore. Um, it's just so rewarding and so beautiful, and uh, you know, I mean, the deer around here, they walk right up to you and nuzzle your hand. The little bunnies hop around right in front of you on the trail, and we have actually several families of grouse living on the property that just kind of walk right up to you and look up and say, "How's it going?" And they don't care. And the wild turkeys and the elk, and there's a moose on the property, and that kind of stuff. And yeah, there are mountain lions and bears and bobcats and things like that too. But it's all part of this natural ecosystem that I love wildness, and it's a wild place, and the sunrises and sunsets are just breathtaking. And you know even on, like, the weather yesterday was really sucky, but at the same time you're getting sucky from the standpoint of, like, you didn't want to be out in it very much because we were in a cloud and it was cold and damp and just raining and whatever else. But I was so grateful for every drop of rain, and just knowing I don't have to water today, or whatever. it's, um, I think it's a great way to live. It's obviously not for everybody, but you don't have to be living in an environment like I am in order to reap the benefits of what I'm talking about. Even if you live in a Manhattan apartment, which I'm sorry if that's where you are, but there are ways of still doing what I'm talking about, and it is possible. There's a huge number of things you can do to be more self-sufficient, at least in terms of your procurement of food and even raising your own food. I mean, like things like quail, if you could bring yourself to get into that, they don't take up much room. They're prolific. They produce eggs and meat, and they're quiet. Rabbits also, things like that. Um, Quiet and really inexpensive to feed. Um, and I mean, there are things you can do without anybody that you live next to even knowing. You don't have to have chickens in your backyard, which a lot of people do, and that's great if if you're into that. Um, I live again in a very pristine, peaceful wilderness environment, and I'm not interested in hearing a lot of barnyard animals. Um, but um, but there are lots and lots of ways a person can become, at least somewhat self-sufficient. Any form of self-sufficiency you can develop, especially around food, is going to give you enormous sense of security. And if you're able to adjust your metabolism to something that is more focused on, just uncompromising nutrient-dense foods that supply ample quality fat nutrients, fat-soluble nutrients and calories, together with just really high quality protein and high quality whatever that plant food is that you like, vegetable or whatever, fibrous vegetables and greens, and maybe, a handful of nuts here and there, and whatever else. You're not going to be hungry. You'll have, you know, you'll be a lot less panicked, I think, financially, and it adds a sense of security that it's hard to get any other way. So.
Somebody that is adopting a diet similar to what we've been talking about today, and they're prioritizing animal foods, high quality, nose to tail. How do you look at supplementation on top of that? We talked about before vitamin A, vitamin D, K2. Those and beyond, how do you look at supplements complementing the diet?
So I think that there is that they need to serve a role. And I'm not a supplement huckster. I don't sell them. I've been asked many times to create a supplement line, and because I know a lot about them, but I'm just not interested in doing that. Number one, I don't want to have the conflict of interest. Like I'm just selling stuff. Hey, buy. Everybody needs this. Buy it. Oh, and I happen to sell it. Um, but also because most supplement companies, um, I have a year-long certification course, and there is a supplement module that talks about just the entire, you know, arena of supplementation and what you need to know about how they're made and what to look for, what forms of things you want to get and why, and all that kind of stuff. It is a hall of mirrors almost out there, and there is a more crap, honestly, than there is really great quality stuff. I tend to buy healthcare practitioner quality supplements. I'm able to do so because I am a practitioner. But the degree to which you can do that is great because those are a little less compromising in terms of additives and excipients and whatever um, unnecessary components. But so say you're somebody that you don't like, there's no way you're ever going to eat organ meats or whatever. You just don't like them. You don't want them. It is possible to get them in freeze-dried form and consume them that way, and you can get benefit from them that way. You're swallowing a lot of pills to get good servings, but it's legit as a way of getting that. So that kind of supplementation could be part of the picture. Maybe you have to add that to your budget. cheaper just to buy the organ meats and prepare them yourself. And there are ways of sneaking those things in without having to taste them too much. But besides that, I think I I I tend to be a fan of ionic trace minerals. I like Anderson research trace minerals a lot. Um, a lot of minerals need to be ionized in the gut in order to be properly absorbed and utilized, made bioavailable to us. And ionization happens through the action of hydrochloric acid. Most people aren't making enough. And especially if you're over 40, those levels are probably going down anyway. So when you consume minerals in ionic form, liquid ionic form like that, they very readily become absorbed and utilized and can do a tremendous amount for your energy because they function like electrolytes really, really well, effectively. Some people, I guess, when it comes to individual supplements, it's kind of like my favorite phrase is "it depends." So much depends on what it is your challenges are, your needs are. That's where bioindividuality comes into play. Do you have an autoimmune condition? Are you nutritionally depleted in some area or other? Do you have metabolic syndrome? Do you need certain things to support that? You know, there are also a lot of things available nowadays that our ancestors wouldn't have had available, that are not necessarily what we think of as natural foods or whatever, or even natural supplements. But because we have so many unnatural things being imposed upon us, toxin-wise and health challenge-wise and things like that, that our ancestors really didn't have to put up with. There's some things, um, like, molecular hydrogen or, even something like methylene blue or, there are all of these things that can provide enormous benefit under certain circumstances that are not necessarily natural things, but can make an unnaturally positive difference, Um, and so, um, we're living in these times where we understand more about how certain things are metabolized and what our bodies might need. Sometimes it gets more complicated than it needs to, but I think it does make sense to incorporate supplementation to some degree or another. And the recommendations I'd be inclined to make for somebody would depend entirely upon their individual situation. I do health consultation work all the time, and I'm not giving everybody the same advice, in terms of here's what, I'll do, expansive, detailed blood chemistry analysis, and it kind of what will imply where the areas of imbalance are. And I know a lot about what the best ways are to kind of remediate those imbalances and maybe support certain things that are challenging somebody. And so it just those recommendations are made on that basis. But you could be popping pills all day long. They're not likely to do you a lot of good unless your foundations are taken care of. Once your foundational nutritional requirements are being met, then you see what you get from that and see what's left over and then adjust what you're doing accordingly and get whatever else you might need accordingly.
Earlier, you mentioned the emu oil. Was that for K2?
Yeah, for K2 MK4 for sure. For people that, may not have access to really high quality, fully pastured poultry fat and that kind of a thing. Or, grass-fed butter for people who can consume dairy, which I can't. There's one form of cultured ghee made by Pure Indian Foods where they did extensive third-party testing to find non-detectable levels of residual dairy proteins in the final product, which most ghee does have residual proteins. This cultured ghee and their particular process seems to eliminate all of that. So that's the only dairy product in my life, and that stuff has good K2 content, K2 MK4. But yeah, the emu oil thing. So somebody suffering from, I don't know, calcified joints or even inflammation. I mean, the emu oil is amazing for that because it's not just about K2. It has omega-3s, it has vitamin D, it has vitamin A, it has all these other things in it that complement and amplify or potentiate, I guess, the value of that K2. K2 is really dominant in that product, but it's got a lot of other things. So it's great for inflammation and a bunch of other things. People seem to do really well on it. It's great for skin and all these other things. You can apply it topically and do all these other things with it. So, yeah, I mean, again, there are companies out there doing great things. What I've typically discovered is that you'll have a company that has a kind of a flagship product that's really unique and really good. And then they create all these peripheral products to kind of help you fill up your cart as you're checking out that are probably, okay or mediocre or maybe entirely unnecessary. And so when I advocate for a particular supplement, I don't necessarily say go out and buy everything they make, but some companies are better at minimizing additives than others. There's the healthcare practitioner brand, Pure Encapsulations, that tends to be, like if you buy a bottle of taurine or something, it's just going to be taurine in a cellulose capsule, and that's it. It's not going to have magnesium stearate and all this other stuff added to it. So, anyway, yeah, it's a jungle out there when it comes to supplementation. But, and I have different things I recommend for different purposes, and some companies I love for certain things and I hate for others. But I do think that supplementation is something that, given the amplified challenges that we're facing in terms of the toxic environment, the toxic soup we all live in and breathe in, we probably have a higher than normal requirement for a lot of things to help us deal with that. And it's hard to get it all from food. And as I mentioned earlier, since, so many of the nutrients have been depleted from our food supply just by virtue of depleted soils and conditions. So, all we can do ultimately is the best we can do, right? We just try to eliminate those compromises to the extent possible. And then at the end of the day, okay, there's still chemtrails landing on your organic garden or whatever. You just do the best you can do. And, if you are, doing a primogenic kind of approach to things, your body's going to be detoxifying more efficiently anyway, and maybe, just drink extra, clean, pure filtered water or, they're just, when I think of all the things I'd be doing, it's just sort of overwhelming to think of how do I encapsulate this in a discussion of this nature. It's a little tough, but I do have my supplement module, but there's a lot to know if you're really wanting to be expert at this, but there's not that much to know if you just want to eat, foundationally well. And again, you see what you get from what you're doing, then you see what's left over and you adjust accordingly.
Given what you said there about the toxic soup we're living in and getting the diet right, helping with that, I'm curious, what are the biggest things we want to protect against in the environment when it comes to toxins? And then specific supplements or modalities like the sauna we can use to detoxify.
Yes, I think saunas are actually great. And saunas, infrared saunas in particular, are important because they do something on an intracellular level to mobilize those toxins out of the cell in a way that conventional saunas don't. And I actually, believe it or not, I live off grid and I have an infrared sauna. I have to hook it up to its own dedicated generator to run it, but it works great. And you can use something like niacin supplements to open up, because our largest organ of illumination in the human body is the skin, actually. And so by opening up, the capillaries of the skin more, which are an actual niacin, and not niacinamide, right? But the stuff that actually causes flushing can do. And then you exercise, and so you get that blood flowing and get it able to reach the surface of your skin, and then spend your half hour, an hour, whatever, a couple times a week in your infrared sauna. You're gonna lose a lot of toxins that way. It is really a great way, a fairly simple way of detoxifying a lot of things. I'm not sure, that we understand what we need to about things like PFAS, the forever chemicals and things like that. We have all kinds of things that are, you know, created in high-tech laboratories that are in our environment now that our bodies may not have a precedent for knowing how to get rid of. And I'm not sure the extent to which we can do it all, but we can do, again, the best that we can do. Um, Obviously things like glyphosate, but I mean, it's like literally in the rainwater, right? And when the farmers burn their fields, poof, up in the air the glyphosate goes, and whatever else is going on. And minimizing plastics. Obviously, I buy almost, if I'm going to buy a condiment or whatever, I am trying to the extent possible to buy glass. You know, and there's silicone things you can use to store things and refrigerate in and whatever else to take the leftovers and do something with that way. Um, just minimizing unnecessary problematic things. Um, um, when it comes to trying to do things with your soil to kind of help sequester a lot of that crap. Um, I mean, I know a lot about what you can do to, eliminate those things in the things that you're growing. There's actually a lot that people can do. There isn't any one supplement or whatever that's going to do it all. I do think that, things like, glutathione and acetylcysteine, things that help to manufacture, that increase your glutathione levels, which is your body's most important antioxidant enzyme, that will oftentimes take the hit so that your tissues don't when it comes to inflammation. Uh, More people than ever are suffering from autoimmune. And so figuring out what kinds of foods that may be, or substances that may be triggering your immune system is really important in eliminating those things. And then figuring out how to put out the fire, which is the inflammation, and then working on healing the damage to specific tissues that may be affected. I know a lot about autoimmune, and it's a major, 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 major. It's probably the biggest actually epidemic of our time that people just don't even realize, because most people are in silent autoimmunity. In other words, their bodies are reacting to certain things they don't really understand until they become sympathetic or symptomatic rather. And then they're trying to go at the symptoms and they don't really realize there's an underlying thing going on. And it's very, very common for people to have an autoimmune condition and not know it, or to have multiple autoimmune conditions actually and not know it. And there are a lot of reasons for that may or may not be discussable in this format, um, but regardless, um, and doing using things that are anti-inflammatory, cooking more with turmeric and things like that that have anti-inflammatory effects that are rather profound, but also because curcuminoids and those things can cross the blood-brain barrier, which not a lot of things naturally can. It can also be can help a lot with neuroinflammation, which can lead to things like anxiety and brain fog and things of that nature. Um, so taking an anti-inflammatory approach to things is always smart, whether you know what's going on with you or you don't. You can't go wrong by helping to quell, inflammation however you can. Hydrating well with really pure, clean water, not the bottled crap and plastic. But, there's a website called findaspring.com, and you can find maybe where in the area that you live in, there are some natural springs that have high quality natural spring water, which we're obviously well designed to consume, assuming it isn't contaminated. But, um, or getting a really high quality filtration system that helps remove those impurities, and just, you know, filling up your glass bottles and going off with that, during the day. Um, Please stop relying on the plastic crap, sold. It's such a ripoff, and so unhealthy. Um, but yeah, I mean, obviously, it's harder for your body to detoxify without adequate hydration.
All right, Nora, I know I got to let you go here. We're going to end on this.
Okay.
I know you're a big fan of eating keto. It's obvious from conversing here. You love ketones, but you're still eating plants. You mentioned growing berries
Well,
in
you
the
can be
orchard.
ketogenic and eat plants.
No,
Yeah.
this is what I'm getting at, though. The fact that it is a slippery slope sometimes, depending on what the plants are.
Right.
Given your emphasis on ketones in the body, are you always in ketosis with the plants you're including?
Well, if it's just fibrous vegetables and greens, I mean, yeah, if I'm going to go out and eat a plum of course, my plums are about that big. So, you know, um, I might eat one in a day. I mean, I'm not out there, you know. I actually use a lot of the fruit that I grow as a bartering item or to make into other things. Um, um, but um, I don't really measure my ketones anymore. What I do know is that I have to remind myself to eat. You know, I'm not. I don't feel. I don't walk around feeling hungry or feeling like I've got. My God, my blood sugar. I've got to do something. That kind of thing. Um, and so I basically kind of go on how I feel and how I function mostly nowadays. I'm not what you call a biohacker that's constantly got myself hooked up all kinds of things and measuring stuff and whatever. I went through that phase, but I don't bother with most of that anymore. I try to stick to the principles that I talk about, and again, I do the best I can with what I have, but um, I'm very, very, very fussy about nutrient density and food quality, and don't do desserts and things like that.
Well, there's even people on the flip side saying long-term ketosis is a bad thing.
Based on
So what I'm getting at is, for you, is that always the goal to be in long-term? And do you see any downside of not being metabolically flexible and going back and forth?
I think metabolic flexibility is a made up term, and I think it sounds nice, but realistically, it takes weeks to get into um, to inefficient use of ketones, right? And there are whole cultures that live in ketosis full time, all the time, forever. Inuit cultures and things like that, traditionally, and they were fine. Um, so, I mean, I think when you're talking about ketosis, so much depends upon the quality of what is it that you're calling ketosis? What is it you're calling? What is your diet? Are you using a lot of little processed keto friendly, you know, num nums and yam yams and, whatever else? I mean, again, like I keep saying, there is many versions of keto out there as there are people claiming to practice it virtually. So it really kind of depends upon what it is you're choosing as a foundational approach to that. You know, um, I see no downside to this because we're uniquely designed to be able to make full time use of that, and we have brains that do better when when we are operating in a state of functional, effective ketogenic adaptation, as I call it. Because you can be making ketones, that doesn't mean you're effectively using them, right? So, metabolic flexibility, I guess that's a term that's sort of a pet peeve of mine too, because it's like, well, what the hell is that? Does that mean you're going to eat carbs one day and eat keto the next and expect you're going to be optimally, doing great in both those days, and in optimally accessing those states? And um, I think you kind of have to pick and choose, what it is you want to rely on. Now, I will say, obviously, if I'm going to go out in, this later this summer when the pears and apples ripen or whatever, and I eat a couple of those, I probably will boot myself out of ketosis for, at least a few hours or something. But it's not, those are little things in the little diversions in the scheme of things. We're never 100% of one thing or the other all of the time. It's a primary source of fuel, right? We're talking primary source of fuel, not sole source of fuel. And so, again, I do believe in relying on ketones and free fatty acids as a primary source of fuel. I think we're well designed to do that. And we've always selectively hunted the fattest, sassiest animals, and our ancestors have always done that. And for a good part of our evolutionary history, we shared the planet with 120 more species of megafauna that no longer exist, but that were a primary resource for us for a very, very, very long time. The people that talk about paleo of the last 10,000 years, they just think about lean meat, lots of lean, because all the animals our ancestors hunted were lean. And well, no, they weren't, and not always. Since the so-called end of the last ice age, which we're actually still in, but we're just in this period of glacial retreat. We lost, 4 species of elephants in North America alone. There were, huge numbers of enormous animals that we relied upon. And it's sort of interesting because one of the things in my background is that I spent the summer of my life living less than 500 miles from the North Pole with a family of wild wolves. That's a whole other interview. But I've followed wolves on their hunts. I've watched them, and I see what they eat and what they don't. And, they typically will go after, the very young or the sick or the old or the, otherwise compromised animals, not because they prefer that kind of meat, but because that's what's easiest for them to catch. They do have a cooperative hunting ability like humans do, but they lack the technology that we do to be able to take down large, very large, fat, sassy, healthy animals, which are very dangerous to procure, by the way. But human hunters were unique of all predators in that we selectively chose the fattest, sassiest animals we could find as our primary source of nourishment, which, is a testament to the value of those foods to us. And we're kind of unique that way. There's an Israeli anthropologist by the name of Mickey Bendor, who's a friend of mine. And he wrote a fantastic paper years ago called "Man the Fat Hunter." It's worth looking up. And he made the case that we selectively hunted and sought out fat as our primary source of nourishment throughout our early evolutionary history. And he makes a brilliant case for that. And I think he's totally right. So, anyway, that's my take on it.
All right. We'll leave it there for today. We're going to link up in the show notes your website, your consulting, your books. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Me too, Jesse. Yeah, it's been great. Thank you so much.
Now that you're done, you're going to want to stick around here and catch this other incredible episode. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
We're all born with about 200 very important microbes, and they're starting to go endangered. Now we're lucky to get a handful. We're missing a lot of them, and I think as soon as the public starts to learn about how important these are.